Rome. Mythical, eternal city, without a doubt one of the most beautiful in the world. Once the epicenter of the Roman Empire, then capital of Italy, this lively metropolis has survived many downfalls. Today, it is bustling with tourists and an impressive number of immigrants.
Without immigrants, Rome would be just a Disneyland for tourists. These people who are really an essential part of the economic and social life of the city.
Rome is home to close to 3 million residents. But most locals have no other choice but to live on the outskirts of the city.
The Rome that you now are showing to people is not the real Rome. It's a city where very few people live, something like 80,000 people. All the other 2 million live outside the Roman walls.
Known for its large-scale architectural riches, this bustling city also hides quaint parks and public places less coveted by tourists.
We're actually in the middle of the city.
Do not tell me we're in the center of Rome.
See, we have to wait in line, don't we?
Beautiful, chaotic, and unpredictable, there's always something new to discover in this very timeless city. Major artistic hub during many centuries, Rome's cultural heritage is nothing short of majestic. And as if its thousands of legendary monuments weren't enough, more than 2,000 palaces and 300 churches are scattered on both sides of the Tiber.
When you're in Rome, it feels like you're in another world. It really does. The city's layout is people-friendly, and its neighborhoods are very walkable, very compact.
Cette ville est absolument magnifique, c'est indéniable, mais est-ce qu'elle est un peu figée dans le temps?
You can obviously get the impression that Rome is stuck in a time warp, that it's stuck in the 60s, but that's what I like about it. And Romans prefer it that way too. They're very conservative. They swear by the idea of an imperial and papal Rome, so they resist change.
Mais qu'est-ce qu'ils vont faire pour rentrer dans la modernité, pour accepter?
Entering the modern age is simply not a part of their mindset, but that's what lends the city its charm. After all, this is a capital city, and this neighborhood, Trastevere, is like a small village. It's very pleasant. All the residents know each other, and they all know the oldest resident here, whom they call Papa. It's a special place, and I wouldn't want that to change. Yes, it can be hard to adapt to such an environment, but it can be very pleasant at the same time. The city is very tradition-oriented, very family-oriented. It can be quite conservative. Yet it's the reason why Rome is so beautiful, what with all its palaces, and the city is very homogeneous. There are no skyscrapers or tall buildings. I find it very charming.
Rome avait une connexion très privilégiée avec le port d'Ostia, qui était inclus dans la ville de Rome.
Yes, Ostia was the first Roman settling. Rome's port was on the Tiber initially, but it was moved to Ostia some 25 kilometers away. By the 4th century BC, it was a bustling trade center, and the waterway was obviously key to that.
Crucial to the creation of the Roman Empire during the 1st century, the port of Ostia has become a vast archaeological site. Located 80 kilometers from the city, the Civitavecchia port has taken the lead.
We're on the Tiber, which the city doesn't really maintain that well, and we're 25 kilometers from the sea, so Romans have easy access to the sea. Water is one of the city's riches. There was even a referendum in 2011 to decide whether to privatize water utilities. The population voted to keep them public.
Rome est renommée pour ses fontaines. Il y en a combien à peu près?
There are exactly 336 fountains, whether decorative or monumental, like this one. At first, they had an essentially utilitarian function. They had mostly hygienic uses at the onset. There were thermal baths, too. Another important concept which lasted until the Renaissance is the notion that man had dominion over nature. Controlling water was therefore a show of power. During the Etruscan period, the founders of Rome had already built the sewers, the canals, and the drainage systems, and as soon as they mastered those techniques, they began to think about building reservoirs and water tanks. But as those were hard to maintain, they thought it might be better to copy the Phoenicians and build aqueducts instead. These famous aqueducts ran some 68 kilometers. Water flowed directly from the mountains to the households of the wealthy, obviously. And in the 4th century, there were 1,352 fountains that flowed freely, 24 hours a day.
Les fameux aqueducs de Rome, il y en a combien déjà?
During antiquity, there were 11, but various branches were added later on for a total of 19 aqueducts serving the city.
Et aujourd'hui, est-ce qu'ils sont encore tous fonctionnels?
Some of the aqueducts are still functional, but some of them were destroyed during the barbarian invasions of the 6th century. As a result, the Middle Ages was a tough period for Rome, since people had to get their water from the Tiber. That was a complete fiasco, as the Tiber was polluted and there were epidemics. It was only during the Renaissance, during the Jubilee years, when the popes encouraged pilgrims to come to Rome, that the fountains were gradually rebuilt, which also meant restoring the aqueducts. Today, the most famous aqueduct is the Acqua Virgo, or the Virgin Water Aqueduct, which still supplies water to the Trevi Fountain, and to the fountain at the bottom of the Spanish Steps, and even the one in Piazza Navona. Nowadays, its use is limited, but the aqueduct is still functional. The Acqua Virgo aqueduct dates back to the era of Agrippa, so 19 BC.
Est-ce que les gens lancent beaucoup leurs sous encore? Est-ce que ça,
Alors bah oui, ça fait partie.
Throwing coins into the fountains, especially into the Trevi Fountain, is definitely part of the tradition. The idea is to throw in a coin and make a wish that you'll return to Rome. You can still see plenty of coins shining through the water in most fountains. Trevi Fountain is the most famous one. Because of its location, people will throw in an average of 2,000 euros a day.
OK, quand même.
During the high season, obviously, but there are tons of tourists, so it adds up fast.
Grand, decorative fountains define the Roman cityscape. But the city's alleyways and piazzas are also lined with fountains for drinking. The Nazzoni, or Big Noses, have been providing water 24/7, 365 days a year for over a century.
En voilà un, fameux Nazzone.
The Nazzoni, or Big Nose. Go ahead, have a drink. See that little hole?
Oui, je me suis pas beaucoup pratiquée, voilà.
It's a bit messy, but it's still refreshing.
Non, mais elle est bonne.
You can tell it's Roman because SPQR is City Hall's official logo. It used to be the Republic's motto. It stands for the Senate and the people of Rome, so it's their water. There are 2,500 of these in all of Rome, including 286 in the tiny historic center alone.
Est-ce que les touristes savent qu'ils peuvent boire l'eau?
Many tourists don't realize they can drink this water, but the city is doing its best to let them know that it's safe to drink and refreshing.
Rome's fountains are active day and night. Most of the city's water comes directly from the Tiber. But oddly, the river seems to have little importance to Romans.
People of Rome are disconnected with the Tiber.
They are. I mean, recently in the film by Paolo Sorrentino that won the Oscar last year, part of it was filmed along here, and people looked at it and said, you know, I never thought about the Tiber as a place you could actually go. One of our models, one of our inspirations is the High Line in New York. Similarly, it was an abandoned piece of urban infrastructure right in the heart of the city, and it was transformed into a vibrant public space. And we see that this, where we are, even though we're right in the heart of Rome, we're on the edge of town. It's an abandoned site. It's an abandoned piece of infrastructure. And so the goal is turning it back into something that's usable by everybody.
Why is it not accessible?
Part of it is the infrastructure. The stairs are steep and dirty and smelly. There are a few ramps for cyclists. Bringing a bike down here to go a few kilometers on the bike path and then going up again on the staircase, it's usually not worth it. I mean, I usually stay up in the city rather than come down here unless I'm going a long way. Well, more and more people are cycling. The current mayor of Rome is a cyclist. He bikes to work occasionally, and symbolically that's important. But the cycling infrastructure is what it is. Wonderful bike path along the Tiber River that we're on now, but it's underwater in the winter, and in the summertime they set up stands in the name of culture, but they're really just commercial restaurants and bars. And so in the summer months, when you would have more people cycling, instead the space is occupied by vehicles and by construction. Rome's very much a car culture. Not really sure why. It's not a practical decision. There's not enough parking. The streets are narrow. It's costly. And yet, I think that since the Second World War, when there was poverty, there was austerity, Italians are still stuck in this mindset that having a car is a status symbol.
How many cars in Rome? Because it's an astonishing number.
I think the statistic is 85 motor vehicles per 100 people. So it's practically, one for every person. And I'm not talking just driving age people, including children and elderly. I'm convinced personally, and this is one of my campaigns in Rome, that the historical center of Rome should be car-free. It shouldn't just reduce the exhaust, cleaner cars, fewer cars. No, it should be car-free. Tourism is huge, and tourism is really the petroleum of Rome. I mean, this is a culture that should be making lots of money from its cultural heritage. Cars are getting in the way of that. Italians criticize me for implying that foreigners know better, and that we should just accept Roman culture the way it is, which is very true, I agree. But my response is, I hope you're not implying that double parking your car with the engine running is Roman culture. I always thought Roman culture was about, beautiful art and aesthetic quality and style, not about double parking.
Tom, is Rome a sustainable city architecture-wise?
Well, I teach a course on that very subject about sustainability in the city, and when you look around the city, you see 85 automobiles per 100 people. You see a city that has serious ecological problems. You'd say no. And I think that it's not a model of sustainability, but it's a laboratory. It's a place where we can understand. Because when you think about it, Rome has been sustainable. It has sustained itself for 2,700 years. It's one of the world's most resilient examples of cities.
How so?
Most people probably think about Rome as a historic city that, saw its heyday and is now just a relic, like an old refrigerator you take to the landfill. I think Rome proves that cities aren't like that. They're always renewed again and again.
Rome is definitely one of the greatest places to study architecture. What about working as an architect here?
I mean, the challenge to Rome is not building new buildings. It's rethinking how to use what we already have. In North America, I'm used to having a building site and constructing a new building on it. In Rome, it rarely works that way because there are very few new building sites. What happens instead is that we consider the shell of an older, even an ancient monument as something that we can build inside of. And so it is new construction. It's just new construction within an existing shell.
Are the Romans open to new construction?
Well, many Romans realized that it's always been a contemporary city, and that if in the 1600s we had decided that we could only preserve history and not build anything new, we wouldn't have had the Baroque, we wouldn't have had Bernini. So it's an ever contemporary city. There is a fairly conservative aesthetic feel, so some of the more glaringly contemporary works, when they're in the historical center, raise some eyebrows. When they're outside of the center, for example, the Zaha Hadid Museum north of Rome, people generally like that very much.
So Rome is considered a resilient city, but then is there a breaking point?
I think a lot of Romans just take it for granted. And they'd say, you know, well, Rome has always been this way. Nothing can ever hurt it. I worry. I mean, I worry that certain decisions have been made, that the damage that we're doing to the environment has accelerated rapidly over time, exponentially. And if Rome falls again, it might not get back up again this time. So I think it is a very key moment that we're in right now, historically.
With its remarkable beauty, it isn't surprising that the Eternal City attracts people from all corners of the world. Laura, who was born in Rome, explains what it's like to share her city with so many visitors.
Dis-moi, Laura, les Romains, qu'est-ce qu'ils pensent des touristes? Parce que je pense qu'il y a presque 30 millions de touristes à Rome.
Oui, je pense.
We get close to 30 million tourists a year. Romans don't really have a problem with tourists. They tend to gripe about money, housing, and traffic. Romans get very stressed out about traffic. And they don't like Marino, the mayor.
Ils aiment pas le maire de Rome.
Jamais.
No, they've never liked the mayor. The city is too big, so it can be quite a challenge to get around by bus or train. But tourism has never been a problem for Romans. It provides employment for many people.
Et Rome sans touristes, ce serait pas Rome, sûrement.
Je sais pas parce que.
If there weren't any tourists, the city would be empty. Look around, all these people are tourists.
Thanks to Fellini's 1960 film, the world now associates the term dolce vita with Rome. The expression describes the city's legendary festive and nonchalant atmosphere. But some Romans now say this Epicurean lifestyle has become more of a myth than a reality.
The dolce vita of the 60s no longer exists. If you walk along Via Veneto, only the ghost of the dolce vita of the 60s remains. It's true that the Rome of lavish parties and great beauty still exists. We call it the grande bellezza. But that's not for ordinary Romans. It's only for the very wealthy.
The reality is that many Romans don't really get to attend these fabulous parties. They also have very limited access to their own city center.
Le centre de Rome est effectivement plus cher que tout le reste de la ville.
Oui.
Yes, the city center is more expensive. Groceries can cost up to 50% more at the local supermarket than in the suburbs.
Combien ça coûte un logement dans le cœur de Rome?
Monthly rent for a 50 square meter apartment will cost about 2,500 euros.
Et puis, tu dois payer.
And then you have your gas expenses on top of that, plus car maintenance, groceries, and other annual car expenses. So ordinary Romans can't really afford to live in the city center.
De rester ici. Si tu vas.
Many of the names next to these buzzers aren't even Italian. That's just how it is. Italians simply can't afford to live here.
J'aurais pas pensé de regarder le nom des personnes qui habitent, mais effectivement, il n'y a pas beaucoup de noms italiens.
And that's just the first entrance we checked. That's how it is in the city center.
Rome is home to the vastest archaeological museum in the world, the fruit of some 2,800 years of history. The quantity of archaeological sites here, be they visible or not, is simply beyond belief.
There are always new discoveries to be made. There's something very interesting to be found every few meters. That's how it is. Contemporary Rome sits on top of ancient Rome. You could say ancient Rome and contemporary Rome are separated by 8 to 12 meters. If you dug down 8 to 12 meters, you'd reach the Roman Empire. This very square sits on top of the remains of a track and field stadium that was built in 86 AD. This stadium lies directly under Piazza Navona. This arcade is part of the original Domitian Stadium. All these buildings we see around here were built on top of the stands, where the spectators would sit. And this stadium could seat up to 30,000 people.
Est-ce que les touristes, et même les Romains qui viennent à la Piazza Navona, sont au courant qui marchent?
No.
Non?
No, maybe tourists would know.
Que les Romains?
Exactly.
Est-ce que la ville met les moyens pour conserver ces différentes époques?
Yes, the city started investing in its history preservation in the 80s. Anyone who wants to do construction must first conduct an archaeological investigation, not just in the city center, but all the way to the seaside. It's like this everywhere, at a depth of 8 to 12 meters. For example, this church was built in the 9th century. This is the San Martino ai Monti Basilica. This is like a second home to me. This is the kind of environment I usually visit or work in.
Pour toi, c'est chez toi ici. Oui.
Can you smell that? That's the smell of history. Isn't that amazing?
Ce qui est incroyable, c'est qu'on soit seul ici. On est au cœur de Rome. On est tout seul.
In total silence.
Il n'y a pas de bruit. C'est le niveau de la rue, ça.
That's the street level up there. This is from the first half of the 3rd century. The main street is in front of us. It's called the Clivus Suburanus. It was a very busy street. And there were likely all sorts of shops along here. Merchants and artisans.
On est en plein Empire romain, là.
Voilà.
Oui.
Then, in the early 4th century, this site was turned into a place of worship for the first Christian communities who could pray openly without fear of being killed or persecuted. It stayed this way until the 9th century. That's when the San Martino Basilica was built. But it was also used as a burial place. There's still a tomb here. Father Giuseppe Mario Tomasi.
It is said that 90% of the ancient underground city has yet to be discovered. But uncovering and preserving the past is extremely costly. Efforts are now coming to a halt and possibly even a full stop.
The people working on these monuments are highly specialized. So it's very expensive. And there are many, many monuments.
Non, c'est ça.
So sometimes it becomes a matter of choosing what to preserve, because there simply aren't enough funds to preserve everything.
Qu'est-ce que tu penses que Rome va devenir dans les prochaines années?
We need to elect politicians who have a vision of how to develop the city, because that's what's lacking right now. For the time being, it's enough to preserve what we have. Personally, I wish a German or an American were at the helm, but you can't have everything.
Non, mais c'est bien, Rome aux Romains. Il faut quand même vous laisser ça.
When you love Rome, you want to see it at its best. Making money is important, but there are many ways to go about it, wouldn't you say?
À qui appartient Rome aujourd'hui?
Rome belongs to the construction companies.
Ouais, Roma.
When Rome became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy in 1871, it was still a very small town. Cradled to roughly 250,000 residents, the old city's remnants are here, in what's known today as the historic center.
You have to think that within the walls, Rome was happy with itself. But the modern city of Rome couldn't stay inside. New satellite neighborhoods were developed.
What is this neighborhood called?
This is called Città Giardino. The city before the unification, before, as we call it, the unification, the moment when it became Italian, it was a medieval capital city of a theocratic state, inhabited mostly by the religious hierarchy, the landlords, and workers and artisans.
And when did that change?
Well, it changed basically with unification. It was not possible anymore. That space should be freed and cleaned for the new wave of bureaucrats that the modern city needed. So they had to import them.
From where?
From the previous capital cities of Italy, both in Turin and in Florence, and they had to evict the artisans that were living here. This process of evicting people from the center had already started in the late 1880s, let's say. But since Rome had immediately a tremendous need of new houses, the building sector became the only truly flourishing industry in the city of Rome. So they would attract unskilled and skilled laborers from Campania region, Abruzzo, Basilicata, and Calabria and Sicily, central and mostly southern Italy.
Can we still feel it today in the city?
Absolutely, because the lack of planning of the urban development of the city brought to the point that you could see Rome on the map as a cluster of small towns. Small town. There is a neighborhood, for example, where 90% of people come from Apulia.
Yeah.
Another neighborhood where they come from Abruzzo, because they don't know the center. They know very well their neighborhood. Saturday afternoon, they want to go to the movie theater, and they say, let's go to Rome. You know, I mean, technically they are in Rome, geographically they're in Rome, but they don't think of themselves as truly Romans. They know almost nothing of the adjoining neighbor or the center of the city. So it is really a fragmented identity. For me, one of the best examples is the way religious figures, saints, are worshipped. For sure, we know that many fights in the center between Montigiani and the people from Monti or other neighbors, they were pelting, you know, stone fighting, one against the other because of the saints, defending their own. My saint is better than yours. So, but because the saint was a perfect sign of the local identity, a very local identity.
Many Italians migrated to Rome, fueling waves of change. International newcomers, contributing to a marked population growth, have also transformed the city.
When did the foreigners start moving in?
A real migration reached Italy only from the early 80s. So the first who came were mostly from Northern Africa, from Morocco, and some people from the Horn of Africa. And the biggest community came out to be the Bangladeshi community. The second biggest Bangladeshi community in Europe is based in Rome, and most of them are living here in this neighborhood, which is Torpignattara. The first issues, the first public discourse about immigration was humanitarian discourse about refugees and asylum seekers. It was not a process of people coming here to stay, to work, to integrate.
To become Italian.
No, that's just people coming here because they were in a need, where they are fleeing their countries because of turmoils or revolution or wars. And what are we going to do? Well, we are a Catholic country, we are a modern European country, we must accept them.
What's the perception of this neighborhood with the Romans? Because it's a very multi-ethnic neighborhood.
This is not a dangerous neighborhood, even though, if you talk to Italians, they have somehow this, siege complex.
Siege complex?
Yes, they feel like, oh, we've been invaded. It's a sense of nostalgia, longing for a mythical past, because it's absolutely a mythical past. Because if you go back to the 50s and 60s and 70s, this was a neighborhood with crime problems, high rate of prostitution, illegal gambling, drug dealing. When immigrants began to arrive and stay here, they reopened many of the shops that had been shut down by Italians because they didn't want to stay here. So while on a way this neighborhood flourished with the arrival of foreigners, there is this image of a past that was definitely lost by many Italians. You see, lined up in, 100 meters, you got a very important sign of Catholic faith with the Holy Virgin, Buddhist temple, and
a mosque.
And a mosque. This is really a clear example of what Rome is becoming.
You need this immigration.
Of course, it is a part of, it's an integral part. Rome had a demographic stasis in the 70s, and only recently the city is still growing in terms of numbers because of these people who are working, who are bringing money, who are participating, who are paying taxes, who are really an essential part of the economic and social life of the city. Without immigrants, Rome would be just a Disneyland for tourists.
From small town to world-class metropolis, migration and immigration waves have shaped Rome's development. But the city has a fundamental identity issue, as two capitals coexist here, one political, the other religious.
Rome is such a peculiar city. There's no city like it because it's a beast with two heads.
Exactly, exactly. During the pre-fascist era, Vatican and Italy were always enemies. They were hostile to each other. The Vatican was always a state since the 4th century after Christ.
It was considered a state?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes. And still is. They have their own mail, they have their own army, they have their own police. Doesn't mean that there wasn't relations between the two societies. I mean, the Vatican Society, through its members, through its aristocracy, actually, was a main part in the urban development of the city. So when the need came to build a new capital city, they were the first people involved. And of course, they took part very heavily in this process. They became the greatest real estate developers in Rome. One of the hypotheses for the development of the new Rome was to develop a whole new city. But Rome never decided if we had to do like Paris, which means destroying everything and build a new capital, or rather do like Vienna, which is building a ring around the old city and build a new city outside. So we did something in between. We cut some main streets in the old part of the city, but not that much. So there are still lots of Baroque and medieval districts remain.
There wasn't a real urbanistic plan.
Well, there are many official plans, but never really follow. And that was the same up when fascists became in power, which is in 1922. And we had to wait the fascists in order to get a peace agreement between the two states. That signed a real break in the urban development of Rome, because there was an actual plan, there was a vision for the city, much stronger than there was before. The idea was to show that the new Rome, new means fascist, was the heir of the old Roman Empire. So everything which was attached to the Roman Empire became much more important than all what was built in between. The aim of Mussolini was to get at least 1 million people city. He never did. But right after the war, because of immigration from a destroyed countryside and a poor south, it became very rapidly almost 2 million people. That is where the modern Rome was built. I mean, the Rome that you now are showing to your people is not the real Rome. It's a city where very few people live, something like 80,000 people. All the other 2 million live outside the Roman walls.
The Vatican still has a tremendous amount of political and economic power. 80 countries maintain embassies to the Holy See, and it also owns close to 30% of real estate in Rome. The Catholic capital's total wealth is estimated at close to 600 million euros.
How is the relationship with the Vatican and the Romans today?
The Italian people is not really very Catholic. I mean, very few people go to the church. So very few people care about the Vatican, I must say. But the Vatican has many relations with our economy, with our policy. No matter what the feeling of people is, the Vatican is some kind of a global power. Its influence goes much beyond the boundaries of Rome or the boundaries of Italy.
The Roman capital and the Vatican haven't always agreed. Their cohabitation has nonetheless given life to spectacular green spaces. Unlike other cities that date back to antiquity, like Athens and Istanbul, Rome was developed in large part through fertile land, rather than proximity to the sea. The Romans' ingenious way of managing water has given life to sublime green spaces that have adorned the city for centuries.
We are in the Appiantica Park. That is more than 3,000 hectares, pretty wide. And it stretches in 16 kilometers of the ancient Regina Viarum, the Appiantica, and reaches right the center of the town, the ancient walls, Mura Aureliane. So we're actually in the middle of the city.
Of course, here we can think that Rome is one of the greenest cities in Europe. Is that true?
It's true. It is true. We have natural reserves that can be regional, like the one we're in, the Appiantica, Parco di Veio. Or we have the Roma Natura parks that are a series of parks that are, the administrative level is the municipality of Rome. Then we have the historical villas. They were private villas that from the aristocratic families of the city that have become public and given to the state.
Like Villa Borghese.
Like Villa Borghese, Villa Pamphili, Villada, Villa Torlonia. That is a very particular type of green.
What's the relationship between the public spaces, the parks, and the Romans?
We have a lot of green areas in the town. The problem is their maintenance. So we have lots of abandoned green areas because the quantity is really so huge. And maybe also the organization of the maintenance doesn't work at its very best. So this is quite an issue in our town. There's a big quantity of land that was rural and is not cultivated anymore, is abandoned. And that's also a problem. They're public parks officially. Some get maintained, some don't. We have monumental trees and botanical precious species and structures, architectural structures that are very precious within them. So that needs a maintenance quite particular and expensive and in need of expertise. There is also an issue, I think, that is the restraint of public space. We have this tradition of having invented la piazza, the piazza. I hear many projects of architects all over the world. They describe their project. At a certain point, they say, this is the piazza. No? They use the Italian word. Well, actually, we are losing lots of our piazzas. They're getting fenced and limited in an astonishing way. This issue is growing. In the suburban areas, we do not have piazzas. We do not know how to make public space because we make suburban areas for cars. Public space are parking lots and roads. And in the center of the towns, the public space is shrinking. Rome has this enormous potential, this fantastic opportunity of its green bits and pieces that can be of all dimensions, very small and very big, like this one we're in here. That is a great potential for public space that can be actually a network that could help the city that is so in difficulty with its transportation, connecting areas, different districts and neighborhoods. And also very fascinating because you get such a natural context that you completely forget you're in the middle of a city.
Do not tell me we're in the center of Rome.
See, we have to wait in line, don't we?
We're right. Buongiorno. Okay, this has got to be the nicest field in Roma.
Communities have gotten together. Neighborhoods have decided that a certain abandoned piece of land was to be recovered, it was a way to reclaim public space in terms of giving more security, have places to go with children, and maybe do an edible garden. We go back to one of the master plans of Rome in 1748, the Nolli map. Well, we notice already in that time, there are many gardens, edible gardens, vineyards. So within the walls already, many gardens, many villas. But going onwards, if I think also at the period after World War II, people have always had this tradition of having their edible garden along creeks and in valleys, because Rome has a morphological shape also that helps that very much. We have now about 150 of these shared gardens in the city, and they're continuously growing. I think there's also a fashion on turning things green, biological food, slow food, attention to going back to tradition and things. And there's also the economic crisis that helps. People want to be self-sufficient, people have more time. We have good weather, we have lots of places to do it. And so there is something, socially speaking, that is moving. And actually, all this garden business, I think, is an excuse for people in search of relationships. Before we spoke about public space shrinking, people need, in the first place, to meet each other. And in the second place, they need to go back to nature, in the city.
Graced with unique beauty and countless historical riches, Rome is one of the most coveted cities in the world. But living here is quite different than stopping by as a tourist. Social and economic challenges, mixed with urban planning issues, are a definite reality, making daily life difficult for many. But history has shown it time and again. Rome knows how to pick itself up and move forward. It is, after all, the Eternal City.